Hello everybody, you were listening to Feed Your Mind, and so there are many proofs of the flat earth dome firmament that we are contained in. In this particular video, we will focus in on how the Operation Fishbowl specifically proves the dome firmament. In later videos, we will cover many other proofs, so make sure you click your notification bell so you don't miss the videos as they become available. And so what you are about to witness is the research I have put together about the Operation Fishbowl program. This is award-winning material you are about to witness. My research into Operation Fishbowl has actually earned me an International Flat Earth Award, which was presented to me at the first annual Flat Earth International Conference in 2017.
Number 11, best dome themed video, Feed Your Mind.
And so before the Operation Fishbowl program, there was this project out in Alaska called the White Alice Project. This was around the time of the Cold War, and America was having communication difficulties with Alaska's widespread open land. And so during this White Alice project is when the military first discovered that when signals are directed towards the sky, they end up bouncing back down to Earth. And so after the military got confirmation of this, they expanded the program into Operation Fishbowl. And so to properly understand the Operation Fishbowl project, we must review what happened in Alaska with the White Alice project. And so our research begins here. Let's play the clip. So today we will be discussing the Great Satellite Hoax and how scientists had mastered bouncing signals off of the dome firmament, which they like to consider the ionosphere. And so this White Alice project was just before the Operation Fishbowl project. So in this White Alice project is where I believe they actually discovered the reflective properties of the dome and how they can use it for communication purposes. And so this White Alice project was located in Alaska. And to this day, you can visit the site and see evidence of these structures that scientists were using to communicate by bouncing signals off of the sky. And as we all know, the sky is not a solid object, so there's no way that they're bouncing signals off of the sky, no matter what they try to tell you about the ionosphere or whatever. They're not bouncing signals off of the sky, they're bouncing signals off of the reflective dome firmament. I believe the dome firmament to have electromagnetic properties. There could be some type of energy that's associated with this force field, in addition to just being a solid barrier structure. And so this took place in the early 50s in Alaska, and the military was having problems communicating throughout the vast open areas of Alaska. The telephone communication systems at that time were limited to cables and wires, and I believe they also had limited signal technology. And so communication was a massive problem for the military to communicate. And so I believe behind the scenes, Russia and the U.S. during the Cold War were actually working on an agenda. And so as scientists were mastering bouncing the signals off of the dome, they noticed that the northern lights actually affected the communication and interfered with the signals. And so that's a pretty interesting piece of information, that the Aurora Borealis actually affects signals. Let me know what you all think about that in the comments section. And so the striking thing about this White Alice military base is that we must remember that this was before satellites existed. So to me, this White Alice military base is empirical evidence that satellite tech is actually signals being bounced off of the dome. This is very solid evidence that satellites do not exist. And so this White Alice base was even before the space race. It was before NASA. It was before even Operation Fishbowl, which I actually believe Operation Fishbowl was directly connected to this White Alice project because they're definitely practicing the same technologies that they were practicing during Operation Fishbowl. So I believe Operation Fishbowl was the finalization of whatever they had figured out in Alaska while they were doing this White Alice project. And so another striking thing about this White Alice project is that it appears there was cooperation between Russia and the U.S. during this project. And so during this White Alice project, the Russians were able to launch Sputnik, which was actually the first satellite said to be launched. And so White Alice means the Alaska Integrated Communication Enterprise. And they were naming the technology tropospheric scattering, and it was named for over-the-horizon communication. I believe this White Alice technology is what led to cellular communication technology and GPS technology as well. They were able to send the signal up into the sky and then have the signal come back down to a location at a satellite base across the land. And so according to my research, it was around 1955 when they were first able to successfully communicate using this technology by bouncing signals off of the ionosphere, which is actually the dome firmament. The lowest point of this ionosphere is 31 miles up, But they say this ionosphere extends all the way up to 620 miles up, as we discussed in the previous video. And what they're able to do is bounce signals from dish to dish. They can bounce over mountains and rough terrain. And they were said to be able to reach distances as far as 200 miles apart. And what they noticed is these signals can support multiple phone calls at the same time. So there's no doubt about it that this is all what we consider to be satellite communication in this modern time. It's basically the same technology they're using today, but they're calling it satellite technology. And so this was a secure system where each signal could only be received by the precise reception destinations, and these signals could not be intercepted. And so after they mastered this technology is when satellite dishes started popping up all over the world. And so to this day, all satellite technology really is signal technology using this system where they're bouncing signals off the dome, and it's also cellular towers and land-based cable communication. What most people think are satellites is actually simply signals bouncing from cell tower to cell tower and from dish to dish, using the dome firmament to bounce the signals. So I will address GPS specifically in another video, so stay tuned for that. Click your notification bell so you don't miss it. And so there doesn't seem to be any empirical evidence that satellites exist. There doesn't seem to be any pictures of satellites floating around in the sky when you're seeing ISS video. There's no little shining beacons of light appearing to us in the sky. They're saying there's pieces of space junk and satellites and all types of stuff floating around in space, but we never see any shimmering lights or any evidence of any of that. Any alleged pictures of satellites are easily debunkable and cannot be verified as authentic. And so this White Alice project seems to definitely be solid empirical proof that satellite technology is not what you were told. And Alaska is also where they have that HARP system. And I believe the HARP system actually helps to charge up the dome firmament. And I believe chemtrails are also related to signal technology because there's metals in these chemtrails, barium and all types of stuff. So I believe the chemtrails are used to help charge up these signals as they're bouncing from dish to dish. And the only reason they're bouncing from dish to dish is because of the dome firmament. And so this White Alice project proves that satellites do not exist. And let me know what you think about all of this in the comments section. And so we just witnessed that the military mastered how to bounce signals off of the dome firmament and how they wanted to expand the project. And so that's where Operation Fishbowl comes in. And during this project, they were able to increase funding and really get ready for this great satellite hoax that was about to take place. In this next clip I'm about to play, we're going to go deep into Operation Fishbowl. Let's roll the clip.
Nike Hercules. Stripey XM33. Thor. Johnston Island was the center of launch and experimental activity for the 1962 high-altitude weapon effects testing termed Operation Fishbowl, geared to collect effects data from nuclear bursts at high altitudes. Standing offshore were 9 instrumented test ships, vital links in the Fishbowl effort. On islands south of the equator, in Johnston's southern magnetic conjugate area, a variety of instrumentation to collect effects data was set up for Fishbowl. All in all, of the 266 Fishbowl instrument stations, 156 were on land, while 10 ships housed 80 separate project stations. 15 test aircraft carried the other 30 stations. The need for the test work carried on at Johnston and its far-flung array was compelling, for it stemmed from urgent Department of Defense operational needs requiring that high-altitude phenomena resulting from a nuclear burst be defined with simultaneous direct measurements on military operational equipment. For while America had been making rapid strides in other aspects of missile technology, its investigation of high-altitude nuclear detonation effects had lagged due to the 1958 test moratorium imposed shortly after the nation's first look at nuclear effects at high altitudes. From a ship in the South Atlantic, 3 small detonations, known as the Argus series, were launched and triggered aloft for the purpose of examining the Christophilus theory that a long-lived belt of trapped electrons could be artificially created by a very high-altitude nuclear explosion. Other effects on Argus, although measured, were not thoroughly documented. In the Pacific, as part of the hardtack series, 3 effect shots, Yucca, Orange, and Teak, were detonated at respectively 26, 43, 77 kilometers, primarily to provide information on the change of blast, nuclear, and thermal effects with increasing altitude. From hardtack's limited test experimentation, one lesson learned was that widely diverse quantitative effects were produced at different altitudes, including major electromagnetic disturbances, causing communications and radar blackout problems. The nature of each effect could be learned only by actual testing. More than the information they furnished, these 1958 shots indicated how much more there was to learn about nuclear burst-created atmospheric ionization. One objective concerned ICBM acquisition, tracking, and intercept problems. It was essential for both defensive and offensive planning that experimental data be obtained on the effects of high-altitude nuclear bursts on radar performance. A third objective concerned communications blackout, that is, the loss of signals due to disturbances in the ionosphere caused by high-altitude detonations. It was necessary to know the ensuing effects on military command and control systems which require long-range communications. These military objectives meshed into the overall fishbowl objective of gaining a vertical scale of information for various altitudes and yields. Included in the wide assortment of fishbowl projects were thermal studies on eye burn, investigation of debris distribution, and documentation of the nature and transport of the magnetic field disturbance generated by high-altitude detonations. On Operation Fishbowl, nuclear detonations rent the sky 5 times over the Johnston Island area, each time during the hours of darkness. Of the 5 fishbowl shots, the highest burst was the 400-kilometer Starfish event, launched by a pod-carrying Thor missile. Its yield was 1.4 megatons. In addition to the local phenomena, the transport of bomb debris and other charged particles in the magnetic field produced colorful aurora, arcing into the northern and southern conjugate regions. Checkmate, like Starfish, did not display a well-defined fireball. Checkmate exhibited a moderate aurora seen in both the northern and southern conjugate areas. Kingfish's fireball was well defined and its aurora moderate. Refraction effects from a nuclear burst are of concern in the high-precision target tracking of ICBMs in the terminal phase. Although radar on the damp ship and Johnston Island showed no gross refractive effects from any of the bursts, preliminary results indicate a refractive jitter problem under certain conditions, involving a rapid fluctuation in the apparent angle of arrival of returning radar pulses. It was present on all events, but most pronounced on bluegill and kingfish. Another electromagnetic effect important to DoD's search capability is clutter, which could hamper radar performance for a period longer than other effects. Radar clutter is caused by ionized air, ionized bomb debris, and electrons trapped in the magnetic field. All these materials reflect radar energy, giving rise to false targets on the radar scope. Our first consideration is the reflection clutter from the fireball itself. Confined to the visible fireball, it is most pronounced when a well-formed fireball is generated. Another problem is presented by field-aligned clutter, observed in that region of the sky for which the observer is at right angles to the magnetic field lines at E-layer heights, and within an azimuth of about 15 degrees to either side of magnetic north. Of the serious electromagnetic effects from the burst, least bothersome to radar performance is noise. Highly sensitive advanced radar systems are adversely affected by the detonation's broadband radio frequency noise, since it reduces the signal-to-noise ratio. In the high-frequency experiments, burst-induced ionization altered propagation conditions, but caused no widespread outage. After the detonation, usable frequencies tended to be higher than pre-burst values. On some paths, propagation conditions were enhanced by the creation of new modes or paths. Almost all conditions had returned to normal by H+2 hours, except on starfish, where effects were detectable Pacific-wide for 2 days. Checkmate caused some adverse effects on transmission paths within 700 kilometers of Johnston Island for about 30 minutes. Kingfish altered propagation conditions on paths within 2,500 kilometers of the burst point, as well as throughout the southern conjugate area for several hours. Bluegill caused blackout for about 1 minute of certain high-frequency signals whose paths passed within 200 kilometers of the Johnston Island area, with lesser effects observed on these paths for 2 hours. Tightrope produced no observable propagation changes. VHF and UHF communication circuits were not degraded by the high-altitude events. Encouraging results were obtained from a strategic air command experiment, testing its airborne communication system during several high-altitude nuclear bursts. Signals from an UHF transmitter on Johnston Island were received by a KC-135 aircraft in the area and retransmitted to a relay B-47, which in turn retransmitted the signal to Hickam Air Force Base. Communications were not disrupted on this circuit by the high-altitude events. The optical measurements documented the spatial, temporal, and spectral characteristics of UV optical infrared effects associated with the detonations in the burst area, as well as the southern conjugate region. In the POD program, concerned with the evaluation of AICBM damage and kill mechanisms, the pertinent finding to date is that X-ray impulses measured tend to confirm predictions. From the extensive measurements on communications blackout, some tentative conclusions can be drawn. VLF is relatively unaffected. However, rapid and persistent phase changes can be detrimental to navigational systems. LF is generally degraded, especially phase-locked systems such as LORAN-C. HF is extensively degraded, but can be improved by the use of a system for rapid frequency shifting. VHF effects are similar to HF, except for less severe absorption. The UHF line of sight is relatively unaffected. Utilization of all these results must reflect the limitations of the fishbowl experiment, the fact that all were night bursts, and that the effects were only based on single detonations. The communications problem resulting from multiple nuclear bursts would be serious, but adequate planning and technical sophistication should make it possible to maintain limited communications at all times. Besides the results on main fishbowl objectives, a host of valuable contributions were made by the many other participating projects. Since the list of findings from the 5 fishbowl events is a long and continuing one, with miles of records still to be reduced and analyzed, this report marks only a beginning in the fishbowl chronicle. With America now of necessity peering skyward in its quest for security, the results gleaned from 1962's high-altitude operation contribute both to this safeguard role and to scientific enlightenment on the effects of the atom above the atmosphere.
And so we have just witnessed plenty of evidence that there is signals bouncing off of the dome firmament. I came across some interesting audio that I haven't been able to confirm the authenticity of, but the thing is the information in it is very powerful, and it connects a lot of dots that we have discussed in this video so far. So let's hear what this whistleblower has to say about signals bouncing off of the dome. Let's roll the clip.
I am a whistleblower who worked as a power supply engineer for 2 of the major companies that claim to manufacture satellites. I have to hide the identity of my voice for protection, but I am real. For 15 years, I was convinced that I actually designed electronics packages, what we call black boxes that are on board satellites. I designed the Mark 271 power converter to convert the solar panel power and regulate it so that it can be used to power the electronics packages aboard the GPS Phase 5 satellites. I also was told I was designing power converters for the Motorola Iridium Class 9A satellites. Then in 2006 I worked for a company in Las Vegas, designing the electronics for the upgraded military smart bombs called JDAM that are guided by GPS. You can Google that if you want to know more. I began to suspect there was something fishy about every company I worked for when on September 17 of 2007 I was pulled aside by an engineer that worked for the Air Force and was the engineering supervisor for the contract. He kept talking about the all-seeing eye and even asked me if I had considered joining the Freemasons and socializing with he and others like Trump. I told him I wasn't into that sort of club because they were just old men. My head began to spin and I didn't know what to say because I thought we were talking about designing GPS modules. He then slapped a $1 bill down on the table and pointed to that pyramid with a floating eye above it that I didn't understand and said, "See, that is the ever-seeing eye. You had better learn who you work for," and he laughed. All of a sudden the smile was gone and he leaned forward and looked into my eyes and said, "You have the highest compartmentalized clearance on this project, and if one word of what we talked about gets to anybody, you will be tried for treason and that carries the death penalty." Then he whispered something that caused chills to run up my spine. "That is if you live long enough to go to jail. Accidents do happen, you know." My head was spinning, I didn't know what was real. I guess he saw my concern and he said, "You will soon understand." He got up and left. The billions appropriated for an expensive program like GPS goes a long way in perpetuating the biggest hoax ever pulled on the entire world by those in power. That was a long time ago to me and I've lived the lie ever since with every project I've worked on, including going through all the trouble to build power supplies for satellites that don't even exist. I don't know if the Earth is flat, square, or shaped like a banana. What I do know is that finding out GPS doesn't come from satellites and that there are really no satellites and exposing that could get me killed. After living this life for many years and having to tell our contractors the lie to keep the engineers in the dark, I want this story to be public in case something happens to me. I am guessing that if I can't get to another country that I'm a dead man. When the space cover-up is threatened, all stops are pulled to prevent it from leaking since it is the biggest lie the government has. There are all sorts of explanations about satellites. Some people might suggest they are actually balloons similar to weather balloons, or aircraft, while some say they even exist and float around above the Earth. Still others claim they do not exist at all and we really get all of our satellite signals from the ground. Satellite uplink and downlink dishes are real. The uplink beams a signal toward the sky, and the downlink receives a signal, and that signal actually comes from the sky and not the ground. Any electronic technician can tell you why a dish would have to pick up a signal from the sky, due to the way they are made, and they have to be aligned to an exact location in the sky. So, if there are no satellites, where does the signal come from? A balloon? Everybody by now should know that balloons are pushed by the winds. Satellite antennas that are used for geostationary satellites do not move. Can you imagine what a nightmare it would be to make the illusion of satellites by putting up balloon after balloon to keep at least one in front of all of the satellite dishes? Since there are supposedly a lot of satellites in geostationary orbit, the nightmare would be even worse. Another problem is that balloons big enough to carry a transponder would be like large weather balloons, which can often be seen from the ground, especially when the sun is at a low angle in the sky and lights it up. All of these balloons would be seen by someone and they would also have to come down somewhere. No, satellites are not balloons, nor are they aircraft. Satellites are also not floating around over the flat plane. It is really quite simple. Engineers have been able to take advantage of some very unique properties of the dome which covers the Earth. Transparent aluminum only exists in theory, but it is said to have unique properties. One of those properties was changing the incident angle of an electromagnetic wave from a normal reflected signal. Without getting technical, I will try to describe what I mean. When you shine a light on a window or shiny surface, the light reflects at the same angle that it arrives. In other words, a mirror placed at a 45-degree angle will bounce light in a manner that it will turn a 90-degree corner. Back during the late 50s and early 60s, scientists were probing the dome with stronger and shorter wavelength radio signals. When their technology improved, they found a strange phenomenon. When a radio signal hit the dome, it did not reflect off at the same incidence angle. The radio signal somehow excited the molecules in the dome in such a way that it appeared to retransmit the signal back at the same angle of the radio wave from the ground. This was a revolution for two different groups of people, and those at the top had a brainstorm. They had just discovered a way to simulate satellites to keep their illusion going in the face of better technology. Plus, this could actually be used to communicate very wide-band signals over far areas across the Earth. In order to understand why this is important, you have to know a bit about radio and communications. Radio signals are based on frequency, or cycles per second, which is called hertz. Radio signals on low frequencies such as AM broadcast can bounce through the ionosphere, but this is not reliable and changes during the time of day. Another big problem is that the lower the frequency, the less bandwidth it can carry. Digital video signals require a lot more bandwidth. The higher the frequency that is used for communication, the more bandwidth you can use. But, when you get up to microwave signals, which are billions of cycles per second, the signal will only go in a straight line and will not bounce off of the upper atmosphere. Let's go back and look at the dome. Because of the unique properties of what we engineers call coherent reflection, satellite dishes can uplink a signal to the dome and it will reflect back down along the same path, but a secondary signal also bounces off at the same incident angle. This allows bouncing it so that it can be picked up not only locally, but in other countries. But, there was a huge problem. Although radio signals were bouncing off of the dome, they were very weak due to the distances involved. I will provide you the exact dimensions of the dome in a later video. It is well understood and has been probed and measured. Another characteristic that was shown in the transparent aluminum model was related to its electrical charge and its excitability to enhance radio signals that it reflects by resonant molecular motion. If only a way to add a small electrical charge to the dome could be figured out, but this was obviously beyond their capabilities. At least until hydrogen bomb tests in the 50s proved that strong electromagnetic signals called EMP pulses are created with bursts at high altitudes. Secret discussions between the United States and the Soviet Union were held after the scientists determined that with a specified number of upper atmospheric air bursts were planned. To this day, I do not know the exact number. The Soviets and Americans set off several at different locations to make this work. These started in 1958, and the first commercial use of a fake satellite by private industry occurred when Echo 1 was supposedly launched in 1960. After the final charging bursts were fired in 1963, the second fake Echo was launched, while an uplink-downlink were provided for international live television signals between Europe and the United States. The atomic tests worked exactly as the engineers predicted, but there is a problem that has started. Although the charge lasts for years, even decades, it is beginning to drop. The physics of the way the charge works is not linear, so as it drops, the reflected signals do not drop until this charge gets below a certain level. Since atomic tests have been supposedly banned, scientists had to come up with another reason to set off a few atomic booster bursts to keep the charge above this threshold. They had to figure out another way to explain to people why they were setting off atomic bombs in the sky. Along came a new idea: what if the Earth was threatened by something, and what better thing than an asteroid? Of course, both Russia and the United States could design and implement nuclear-tipped rockets to either destroy and nudge a large asteroid over. All of a sudden there are asteroids passing between us and the moon, making near misses. This is a planned programming of the population, so that when the time comes to set off a few more atomic bombs that can be seen from the ground, there will be no question what they are used for. Just like the global illusion, we have come a long way since the first television broadcast that supposedly used the Echo satellite, which was a large inflatable balloon covered with mylar and flashed aluminum. Once they discovered the dome could be used for radio communications, there was a need for more channels and thus more satellites. This is where a big problem for engineers occurred. When the signal hit the dome and reflected, it spread out, and it was impossible to reflect different signals within a few degrees of each other off of the dome. Engineers who had developed radars for the Navy and military had used a system called phased array antennas at microwave frequencies to scan very narrow beam radar signals up and down.
And so what we learned in the last video is that NASA has to charge up this dome firmament in order to better control the signal response of all of these signals bouncing off of the dome firmament. And so not too long ago, there was a strange experiment that NASA was doing with allegedly detonating explosives on the moon in order to find water. Well, with the information we have discovered in this video, it's very possible that NASA was actually charging up the dome again. I also believe HARP and the chemtrail program and many other programs are all assisting in the signal responsiveness with the dome firmament. But this moon bombing incident really stood out to me because the whistleblower in the last video said that the dome requires a detonation every once in a while, and that's just what they were doing in the Operation Fishbowl program. Not only were they mapping the dome firmament, but they were detonating massive explosives against the dome, apparently to charge the dome up, and the charges are said to last years. So let's check out this moon bombing video footage and let me know what you think about this. Let's roll the clip.
Since atomic tests have been supposedly banned, scientists had to come up with another reason to set off a few atomic booster bursts to keep the charge above this threshold. They had to figure out another way to explain to people why they were setting off atomic bombs in the sky.
We're looking at an image from a lunar probe, and down there somewhere closer to the moon is an actual 2.2 ton rocket that's going to set off a big plume. Should happen shortly. Let's listen and watch.
Science, please change NIR 1 to OPR 9. Over.
Copy NIR 1 to OPR 9. Command flight, set it up. Set November or Mike? November. Science flight, confirm that's November. IR.
We are, the science team is now communicating to the flight team to adjust some camera levels.
Science flight, confirm near infrared, November, correct?
On
Confirm.
Near infrared camera.
Send NIR 1 to OPR 9. Copy, sending command. All stations flight, mark Centaur impact.
That was an announcement by the flight director that the Centaur impact should have...
Flight payload, confirm receipt of command, over. Flight payload, curtain start, over. Copy that, payload.
We should be looking for some signs of the impact on the leftmost part of the...
by with mid-infrared changes.
The left side of the shadow, right below the dimpled crater on the larger crater rim.
Flight, this is Science. Make the rate changes. MIR 1, 1 hertz. MIR 2, 0.1 hertz. Over.
Copy, Science, command flight, MIR 1 to 1 hertz. Sending MIR 1 at 1 hertz.
And the science team is directing the flight team to adjust the sampling rate of some of the instruments to fit within the 1 megahertz.
Ready with MIR 2 at 0.2, 0.1.
The 1 megahertz signal limit.
Go flight. Command flight, send MIR 2, 0.1 hertz. MIR 2, 0.1 hertz.
Well, there's going to be a second impact, but we understand even though it was not detectable by our eyes, there was an impact, and it seems, according to some of the jargon we heard, to have been successful. Jim Garvin is with us. He's a former NASA scientist. Jim, we're trying to pick up what happened. What can you detect?
Copy that, payload.
Well, we're waiting for the first sign of the flash that we'll see with one of the 9 instruments on the L-Cross shepherding spacecraft. And meanwhile, the observatories on Earth, including the one in Earth orbit, Hubble, is watching these for the signature of this plume, this curtain of debris that has been jettisoned by this 2.3 metric ton impact. So that's where we are.
But Jim, is it your understanding that it has successfully impacted? Because it doesn't sound like we've seen a plume.
Much more quickly. To continue pointing at affected Centaur impact point, even though the...
So Jim, this right now is the point of view from the L-Cross lunar probe. It's going to crash into the surface of the moon in about a minute and a half or 2 minutes, and it's supposed to fly through all this 6-mile-high debris field. And it's at that point that the craft will detect whether or not there's water in the atmosphere, right? Or rather, kicked up.
The L-Cross mission.
Right, Jim Garvin?
Yes, that's one of the ways we can tell. The shepherding spacecraft has instruments in the near-infrared, the mid-infrared, that can detect the signatures of water in different phases, particularly a gas phase. So we'll see how much is there down to a %. We can now see the event coming on behind me right now. And then other observatories will see the effect after the fact.
What do we just say, Jim? Do you think we just saw the dust plume?
NIR2 to OPR.
We just saw it.
So the
now
TV
we're changing the rates on some of the cameras so we can sample the data well enough to get it back from Earth.
So, Jim, when we just saw that white flash, that was the L-Cross shepherding aircraft, as you refer to it, flying into this great big dust cloud.
Right. What we were seeing was the flash of the impact of the big empty upper stage on the moon, the force of several hundred pounds of TNT, and then watching that flash with the shepherding satellite following 4 minutes behind.
Now, Jim, tell us the significance of this today.
Spacecraft trajectory as it approaches the lunar surface. We are seeing very small craters within the
Jim?
They're getting very close.
Thermal signature of the crater.
Okay.
Our cameras. Over.
Great. We're getting the temperature signature of the pulse from the impact, which we expect several hundreds degrees increase in temperature in this very cold place.
Flight shepherding spacecraft impact. Stations report LOS.
Okay, we've lost signal now on the shepherding.
Ground stations at Goldstone just reported
West Texas, 11:35.
Okay.
And so they definitely weren't bombing anything against the moon. I mean, that video footage was pretty easy to tell that there was nothing going on like what they were telling us was going on. There had to be a whole nother thing that was going on that they didn't want us to know about. And so to conclude this video, let's go over a bunch of the information that we have discovered and try to put it all together and figure out what we can about this dome firmament. As we know, in Operation Fishbowl, NASA was able to map the dome firmament structure above us. So now I believe we have enough information and research. And so maybe we can figure out some more details about this dome firmament structure as well. Let's roll the clip. Today we will discuss the height of the dome firmament explained in detail. And so our research begins with the Van Allen radiation belt. The Van Allen radiation belt is said to be a band of deadly radioactivity from the sun that surrounds the Earth. And it's the main reason why the moon landings never happened, because there's no way that astronauts were able to make it through these Van Allen radiation belts without getting cooked, like a microwave. And so this Van Allen radiation belt is said to begin at 620 miles up and extends all the way to 3,700 miles up. And then there's a coincidence with the 620 miles up, because that's actually the height of the ionosphere as well. The ionosphere is said to be about 620 miles up as well, and it is described as a shell of electrons and electrically charged atoms and molecules that surround the Earth. That sounds very similar to the Van Allen radiation belt. And so are these the same things, just two different names possibly? The ionosphere and the Van Allen belt being the height of the dome firmament? Because an interesting thing about this ionosphere description is it says a shell of electrons. A shell to me sounds like a solid object, a firm and solid object. And so I have an interesting video coming up about satellites and how they interact with the ionosphere in order to bounce signals back to Earth. Because the thing is, the scientists are literally saying that they're bouncing signals off of the sky. Now, their excuse is saying it's a shell of electrically charged particles, but this seems to be their excuse and their only way to describe what they are witnessing. Because if you think about it with common sense, the air is supposed to be thinner the farther you go up. And so how are they possibly bouncing signals off of the sky? You see, satellites do not exist. They're just bouncing signals off this reflective dome firmament. The reflective properties of the dome firmament is part of the reason why you see rainbows, sundogs, and more. Because according to my research, the dome is most likely some form of reflective material. There's descriptions that say it's as a molten glass. Molten sounds kind of metallic, and it could be a reflective metallic type glass. It sounds like it's probably see-through as well. And so this material doesn't seem like it's known to mankind. But there's also another striking coincidence of this ionosphere, because they say it begins 31 miles up. And so 31 miles up is actually the same height of the highest balloon that has ever been launched. You see, balloons will always pop around 30 miles up or lower. And this is allegedly due to the low air pressure that forces the balloon to expand until it bursts. And so scientists have been creating these balloons to be more flexible so they don't burst. And so that's basically what a weather balloon is. But from what I'm hearing, they always pop anyways. So what is causing these balloons to pop at 32 miles up? And what's with the coincidence with 32 miles being the lowest part of the ionosphere? And so, like I said, the ionosphere ranges from 31 miles up to 620 miles up. So if it begins at 31 miles up, that could possibly be the lowest point of the dome firmament. Now, the reason why I believe they're saying these are ranging from 31 miles up to 620 miles up is because the curved nature of the dome. You see, if the dome is an arch-like shape, there would be various points of height on the domes. And so I suppose the lowest points would be around 31 miles up. But that seems to be the average point where balloons pop no matter where you are. And so let me know what you guys think about all of this in the comments section. Most balloons usually only range from 11 to 23 miles up, so this 32 miles up was an exception, and this happened around 2002. And so polar orbiting satellites are said to be as low as 444 miles up. The ISS is said to be about 220 miles up. Low Earth orbit is said to begin around 100 miles up and is said to range to about 1,200 miles up. And so I'm rejecting the 1,200 miles up scenario because there doesn't seem to be any evidence of anything being more than 30 miles up. Outer space is said to actually begin at 50 miles up. So if space doesn't exist, that means the dome could be under 50 miles up, especially in some areas. And so to summarize this video with all this information I presented, it appears there's no proof that anything has ever went more than 30 miles up. 32.9 miles precisely seems to be the record of anything that has ever launched. And so that's basically 33 miles up. And so what do you all think? Do you think the dome is 32 miles up, or is it just in some places 32 miles up? Or are you going to go for the 620 miles up hypothesis, where the Van Allen belt begins and the ionosphere ends? Or I suppose it could be somewhere in between as well. So I suppose I'm going to lean more towards the dome being somewhere around 50 to 100 miles up. And maybe 100 to 600 miles up could be the second heaven area, possibly. Who knows? Because maybe that's the area where the stars and the planets, which are actually stars as well, hang out. In my last video, I discussed how planets are actually stars. So make sure to check that video out if you get a chance. And so the second heaven area seems to be around the range where scientists are saying the orbit begins, with the ISS being 220 miles up. So I'll also be covering the ISS in a later video as well. I'll basically be redoing my video about the ISS with commentary this time. It's about time for an update on that video because I had to remove the audio from that video due to some copyright issues. So I plan on redoing the ISS Seen from Earth video. And so click your notification bells and stay tuned for that. And then I really want to know what you all think about this information presented in this video. It doesn't seem like anything is permitted more than around 35 miles up, but that doesn't necessarily mean the dome begins there. If there's that second heaven area, the dome could actually extend up to about 620 miles up, and that could be the actual solid dome firmament. And so either way, this kind of puts into perspective the height of the dome firmament as far as I can investigate at the moment. With the research that is available and putting two and two together, there seems to be pretty much a range from as low as around 30 miles up to as high as 620 miles up. Let me know what you think in the comments section. Once again, join my Patreon page for as little as $1 for exclusive information about unreleased videos on the way. Pick up a Flat Earth t-shirt or a coffee mug from the Feed Your Mind store. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. This has been another episode of Feed Your Mind signing off.